In our last lecture, we looked at Winston Churchill at home at Chartwell. We saw him as an author, we saw him as a family man, and we saw him as a painter. And it is as a painter that we gain one more insight into the richness of his soul, the very fiber of his being, above all his optimism. That optimism that led him to say, never give up, never, never, never. Never weary, never despair, never surrender. We look at these paintings from the 1930s, paintings when, for example, he's visiting friends on the Riviera, and we see their swimming pools with the villa shimmering in it reflected. We see magnificent seascapes painted in these bold colors. And we wonder how, within a few years, that will all be shattered. German troops will march down the streets of Paris, and Europe will be in danger of falling into a new dark age, made even more sinister and protracted by the light of a perverted science. The gathering storm, that is what Churchill called it, and that is what he saw long before most statesmen and politicians in Britain were willing to admit it. But by 1930, when Adolf Hitler was still 3 years from power, Churchill was without influence in Britain, and it was generally thought that his career was over. One of his really great bête noirs was Nancy Astor. She was an American, Lady Nancy Astor, and had become the first woman member of Parliament. And she hated Churchill. She was constantly deriding Churchill. On one occasion, reportedly, they were at a dinner party, and Nancy Astor said, "If you were my husband, I would put poison in your cup." And Churchill said, "Yes, and if you were my wife, I would drink it." And so she was on a visit to Stalin. She was a great admirer of the Soviet Union. And Stalin said, "Who are the coming leaders in Britain?" It's 1931. And she said, "Neville Chamberlain is the coming man." And Stalin said, "What about Churchill?" And Nancy Astor said, "Churchill is finished." And so too in 1932, when he had an opportunity to meet Churchill, Adolf Hitler refused, saying, "Churchill is finished." And Churchill may have shared that view in 1930. He was, after all, 56 years old. That's well into middle age. He wrote a book, a wonderful, charming book, My Early Life, a roving commission, My Early Life, it is called in America. And it is a man looking back over a life that is finished. He can look back upon the fall of his father from power, look back and chuckle about his school days, his time in the army, and writing about his father, but really reflecting upon himself. Churchill says in this book that a man who loses his position in the 30s and 40s, that is to say when he's 30 or 40, will never get it back. He may get another position in his 50s and 60s, but the height that he reached in those early years, he can never reclaim. He's talking about himself. He was 56 and he looked it. He was stoop-shouldered, as we saw, 215 pounds, 5'6". He looked old, bald-headed. He was once sitting in the barber's chair, and the barber said, "What kind of hairstyle would you like?" And Churchill said, "A man of my limited resources cannot afford a hairstyle. Just cut." He always wore old-fashioned clothes. He carried a walking stick still that had been given to him by King Edward VII, not long after the turn of the century. "To my favorite minister, to my youngest minister," was inscribed upon it. He wore a frock coat frequently and carried a huge old-fashioned pocket watch, the turnip, his children called it. He spoke in old-fashioned phrases. He made Stanley Baldwin, who was quite a classical scholar, wince whenever Churchill pronounced Latin. Churchill said, "You have taken away from me the good old Latin. I used to say, veni, vidi, vici, and you want me to say this atrocious, winnie, weedy, wiki. How wrong, how wrong." And he never would have, for example, called it Beijing. It would have always been Peking to him. He didn't like words like pundit, strange words that have been incorporated into our language. He didn't like people correcting his pronunciation of French words. He once said to a friend, "You like to say you go to Marseille, take the train up to Lyon, and then on to Paris. I'm happy to go to Marseille, stop at Lyons, and go on to Paris." Old-fashioned, out of step. He also wrote in my early life that a prime minister must reflect not only the need, but the mood of a nation. And the mood of Britain in 1930, and well on into the 30s, was out of step with Winston Churchill, increasingly out of step with his grave concern over the rise of German power. He had seen it early on. In the 20s, he had said, "I see those sturdy German youth marching. They are looking for weapons. They are determined to overcome this humiliation. They are determined to restore what they see as their national honor, and they will find a leader to make war again." But Britain did not want to hear of war, and it was even more uninterested in war in 1930 than it had been in 1919. The decade, the 20s, brought forth ever more information and facts about how pointless the war had been, how fruitless had been the slaughter, an entire generation shorn off for nothing. The Versailles Treaty was held to have been a grand failure, imposing upon the Germans impossible payment demands, forcing the Germans to sign a war guilt clause. We were all equally guilty. And fine minds like John Maynard Keynes denounced the Versailles Treaty. What had the war been for? Nothing. Patriotism became an outmoded word. At the Oxford Union, where the finest young leaders of New Britain would be educated, the members took an oath never to fight for king and country. Churchill called it an outrageous statement. But he was heckled down at the Oxford Union. Old-fashioned, out of step. Leading films and books like All Quiet on the Western Front simply hammered home this lesson of the futility of the war. And what is more, the war had removed England from its pinnacle of economic power. In economics as well as in politics, victory in the First World War had been bought at a price that made it indistinguishable from defeat. Britain never recovered from the economic disaster of the First World War. The Great Depression of 1929 struck hard at Britain. And once again, it was Churchill who took part of the blame. He was blamed for having put Britain back upon the gold standard. And it was said that he was responsible for the Great Depression. And then the empire. It was no longer a source of pride, but to many British, just a burden. The idea of the land of hope and glory, the hymn that we looked at in an earlier lecture, had faded. The idea that the British were bringing civilization and liberty to the world had become laughable in the minds of a new generation. The empire was something to be gotten rid of, starting with India. And the Conservative Party as well as the Labor Party both worked assiduously to grant dominion status, looking forward to full independence to India. It was another view with which Churchill was much out of step. And so he would come to Parliament. He would speak out against the proposal to give dominion status to India, only showing how far removed he was from the tempo of the time. He continued to make enemies. He continued to speak with venom and sarcasm. One occasion, speaking of Ramsay MacDonald, in the early 1930s, then Prime Minister, although working closely with Stanley Baldwin, Churchill spoke of Ramsay MacDonald and said, you know, it is amazing how he can take political fall after political fall and always get up. His hair a little out of place, but smiling. When I was a boy, and Mrs. Churchill had urged him not to put this following into his speech. When I was a boy, I was taken to see the Barnum Circus. And among the exhibits of monstrosities and freaks was the boneless wonder. I said, I want to go see that. But I was told it would upset my youthful nervous system. And so I have waited 50 years to see, sitting as Prime Minister, the boneless wonder. Well, that did not gain him friends. On November the 11th, 1918, Churchill walked hand in hand with Mrs. Churchill through cheering crowds. Victory had been won. That same day, in Germany, lying in a hospital bed, was a corporal. He had been blinded in a gas attack, and as he lay there, the chaplain came in and gave the news that Germany had surrendered. How could this be possible? Adolf Hitler said. We had been on the verge of winning, and with that my whole world crumbled. And I swore an oath there in that hospital bed that I would avenge this crime against my country, and that I would devote my life to the overthrow of the November criminals, to the Jews and socialists who stabbed our nation in the back. You cannot imagine two men more different than Churchill and Adolf Hitler. Hitler had been born April the 20th in 1889 in circumstances very different from those of Churchill. Not in poverty, as he liked to claim later. He was, after all, the master of the lie. But in perfectly comfortable surroundings. His father had been a customs officer in the old Austro-Hungarian Empire, had retired, kept bees in the countryside, and had a perfectly reasonable pension. Hitler's mother doted upon him. Like Churchill, he did very badly in school. He would say, putting it into our terms, show me a boy with a 4.0 GPA, and in 10 years I'll show you a failure. All teachers want to do is turn you into carbon copies of themselves. And again, in our terms, if they could do anything, they would do it. They wouldn't be teachers. So he despised learning. He was smart enough, and the teacher said if he would discipline himself, doesn't that sound familiar from Churchill's teachers? If he would discipline himself, he could accomplish something. And he wanted to be an artist. Churchill came to painting late. Hitler wanted to be an artist from his teenage years, but he couldn't get into the art academy there in Vienna. I think not because he was a bad painter. Some of his paintings from these early years still exist, and they're not bad. But he didn't have a diploma from high school. He had no connections, and so he couldn't get in. And while Churchill was serving as First Lord of the Admiralty, Adolf Hitler was tramping the streets, first of Vienna and then of Munich, bringing into himself what Churchill would later describe as those soul-destroying hatreds, building up a hatred against the Jews, against the socialists, imbibing the racism of Vienna in those years, developing an absurd pride in his Germanness. And then, when the First World War came about, it was a tremendous liberation for him. We have a picture, interestingly enough, a photograph, not taken intentionally of Hitler at all, but of Hitler throwing his hat up into the air when war is declared and he is there in Munich. And he served with gallantry during the First World War, winning the Iron Cross, and then only to see this world collapse and to set out on this course of rebuilding Germany. Now, Churchill spoke to all that was best in men and women. But there is that other side. Men and women are evil as well as good. And Hitler spoke to all that was evil, to the malice, the suspicion, the treachery that lurks in human nature. And Germany of the 1920s and early 30s provided the most fertile of breeding grounds. It was a nation that felt itself stripped of honor, reduced to a meager army, no air force, no fleet, forced to accept blame for the First World War, burdened with reparations, and without any confidence in the government that had been imposed upon it. Churchill said at the time of Versailles, "Let the Kaiser stay on his throne. That will give a focal point." But this was stripped away. Political party after political party, falling and rising with governments. An utter lack of faith in democracy. And then crippled economically, first by a huge inflation that destroyed the savings of the middle class, and then by a depression equaled only by the depression in the United States. And there, Hitler flourished. He said the same theme over and over again. It is the fault of the Jews. It is the fault of the socialists. He knew that the way to win the hearts of men and women was by telling the biggest lie possible. And you know, he said all of this openly. He had been arrested after a failed attempt in 1923 to overthrow the government, and he used his trial not to apologize, but to speak out openly. Heads will roll. Germany will be avenged. And his brief prison term was sort of a celebration, receiving packages, running around in his little lederhosen, and writing a book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. The world for him was an unceasing struggle. And the race, the purity of the race, was what mattered. The strong race won out, and others were meant to be dominated. And that race must be pure. And to Hitler, the Jews were the greatest defilers of the race. And he said, we must find our room in the East. We must first win back our honor by conquering France, and then expand out into the East. Well, Churchill read this book as soon as it was translated into English. He never learned German. I will not learn their beastly language until the Kaiser marches upon London, he had once said. But he read it in an English translation. And he understood this man means it. This man means it. And he followed the rise of Hitler. And when Hitler became chancellor in 1933 in January, and when one of his first actions was to strip the civic rights of Germans who were Jewish, to strip them away, Churchill said, you cannot allow one group of people to be stripped of their rights without its coming home to you. But you see, the easy thing to say always, we hear it again, is we should not interfere in another country's internal affairs. Well, that's immoral. That's wrong. You cannot allow evil to be done anywhere. And Churchill spoke out. He would later say that the Second World War ought to be called the unnecessary war. No war would have been easier to stop if only it had been met, the threat of Hitler had been met with firmness. But that is the very thing that Stanley Baldwin and later Neville Chamberlain did not have. They did not have firmness. And they wanted to suit the mood of the British people. Stanley Baldwin would say, in a statement that Churchill said was the most shocking he had ever heard in his long parliamentary career. At a time when the threat was growing obvious, in 1936, Stanley Baldwin said, "If in 1935 I had been talking to Parliament about rearming and the danger of war and increased military spending, that would be the easiest way to have lost the election." What an abdication of responsibility to allow the military power of Britain to be threatened because you were afraid of losing an election. You lead, you don't follow, Churchill said. But no one was really following him in the 1930s. The first test case really came in 1936. Hitler had begun almost immediately to rearm Germany. The German armed forces, the Wehrmacht, was supposed to stay at 100,000 by the Treaty of Versailles. It was obvious by 1935 it was being expanded and was well over 1 million. The Germans were not supposed to have a military air force. They had one. This was an obvious breach of the Versailles Treaty, and by that treaty the French and British could have marched into Germany and removed Hitler. They did not. Why shouldn't the Germans have an army? We have one. Let them have one. And then on March the 7th, 1936, German troops moved into the Rhineland. That area that has cities like Cologne and Bonn. By the Versailles Treaty, it was demilitarized. The Germans could not have forces there. They could not build fortifications. That was the great protection against France. Great protection for the French against the Germans. And yet on this bright morning, German troops moved in. Now that was an even clearer violation of the treaty. The French and British were obliged to attack. The German general said later that the whole of the Nazi regime would have fallen if only a few French troops had appeared, but they didn't. The Germans are just going into their own garden. Neville Chamberlain and Stanley Baldwin were worried about the effects upon trade of any military action. And so Hitler was given the proof he needed that the Allies would not respond. And openly, Stanley Baldwin and his closest associate, Neville Chamberlain, spoke of a policy of appeasement. That meant a policy of peace. Let's work things out. Let's negotiate. And surely if Hitler is able to put troops into the Rhineland, that will satisfy him. Churchill was already speaking out. He was being provided at great risk with confidential information about the size of the British military establishment, above all, about its Air Force. And he knew that in 1935, Stanley Baldwin, under constant questioning in Parliament from Churchill, had promised that the British Air Force would always be kept at parity, at the same level with the Germans. And he knew the Germans had twice as many aircraft. And so he kept questioning and probing. And finally, the figures became too obvious for anyone to dispute. The Germans had far more planes. And so he asked Stanley Baldwin and Baldwin's associates there in Parliament, "How can you have promised to us that we would be kept at parity?" And the Minister of Defense, Secretary Hoare, said, "Well, the situation is fluid." Churchill said, "And so they go on. They go on. Decided to be undecided. Resolute to be irresolute. Adamantine for drift. Solid for fluidity. All-powerful to be impotent. These are the years that the locusts have eaten." The power of Germany was becoming too great to resist. And Churchill began to build a following. An anti-Nazi league was formed. Leading members of Parliament and leading members of British life overall began to speak out against this Nazi danger. And once again, the impetuosity of Churchill all but destroyed him. He had regained a considerable place of influence. And then, This year, 1936, Britain was shaken by a crisis that seems absurd to us looking back upon it. The old king had died, and the new king, Edward, sort of debonair, playboy type, hated by Stanley Baldwin, became king. He had not married, and one of the first tasks of an English sovereign is to produce children, heirs to the throne. And not only that, but he was openly keeping company with an American, a divorcee, a woman of loose standards, and a woman really too old to have children, Wallace Warfield Simpson. And he made it known that he was going to marry her. And the Prime Minister said, "Please talk with your mother about this." And the mother said, "You cannot marry her." He said, "I love her, Mom." And she said, "I know, but she is utterly unsuited. She is divorced. That is against the Church of England." Well, maybe we can get that overseen. "She can't have children." Well, maybe she can. "She's an American." Ooh, that's probably the worst thing about her, I suppose, but what can we do? Stanley Baldwin said, "Sire, if you go ahead with this wedding, it will create a constitutional crisis. She cannot be queen. You must put her aside." And again, his mother said, "Think of all the sacrifices the little people made during the last war. Surely you can make this sacrifice." But Edward was determined. And he found one champion. I mean, everybody else was opposed to it. The newspaper, the little people were opposed to it. They didn't want this American woman on the throne. One champion, Winston Churchill. Now, his wife, Clementine, said, "Stay out of this. He is a silly little man. Let him destroy himself." But no, Churchill asked permission of Baldwin and then goes and talks with the king. And the king would later say, "When Mr. Baldwin spoke about the monarchy, it was a faint little thing. But Mr. Churchill infused it with vibrancy. It was a live thing, and I wanted to be king." So he told Churchill, "I'll stay on, I'll fight." But he didn't. He agreed to abdicate, but he didn't bother to tell Churchill he had agreed to abdicate. So Churchill goes into Parliament and starts to make a speech. "I want the Prime Minister to promise that nothing final will be done." And the shouts of anger, the visible hatred on the faces of the members of Parliament surpassed anything other members had ever seen. "Sit down! Shut up!" And Churchill, astounded at this blast, said, "Promise me that nothing final will be..." And he didn't. He was drowned out. "You won't be satisfied until you've broken him," he said to Baldwin. And the dear vicar, Baldwin, just sat there quietly. Churchill had destroyed himself, and he wouldn't need to worry too much about more probing questions. And the silly little man would abdicate and go off to be a very silly little man with his silly little duchess over the years. But Churchill's influence suffered a tremendous blow. And so step by step, first Hitler annexed Austria. Well, it's a German-speaking country. Let them have it. And Churchill's voice raised against this had little influence in Parliament. There were others outside of Parliament who knew he was telling the truth, who knew how important it was to get his message. But even his best friend, Lord Beaverbrook, the great newspaper magnate, in this critical moment stopped Churchill's column, would not have it printed. The BBC refused him the right to broadcast. And so would come then the great crisis at Munich, when Neville Chamberlain, now Prime Minister, believing that Hitler kept his word, he was a man you could deal with on an honest and honorable basis, would go off to Munich, September of 1938, and with the French premier, give away Czechoslovakia, strip it of its northern frontier, allow the Germans to occupy the northern part of Czechoslovakia, and prepare the way for war. And such was the foolishness of people that when Chamberlain came back and said, "I bring you peace in our time," they cheered. A few days later in Parliament, Churchill said, "I do not deny our people the joy that they feel at the moment, but we have suffered a total, unmitigated defeat." Silent, mournful, broken, abandoned, Czechoslovakia recedes into the darkness. She has suffered in every way by her association with the Western democracies. And do not think that this is the end. It is but the beginning. It is the first taste of a bitter cup that will be proffered to us year by year, unless we recover by a supreme effort our moral strength and martial vigor and take our stand for freedom as in the olden time.